Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 26, Lesson 4, The Effects of the New Deal. So, as you know, FDR was trying to fix the economy. He did have a lot of critics of his New Deal. First of all, at first, businesses were in favor of what he was doing, but eventually they started to criticize him, saying Roosevelt was spending too much money, and they didn't like that the government was having so much power over businesses and the economy in general. So he started getting pretty criticized. There are three major people I want to talk about who were very vocal in their criticism. First one is Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was a Detroit priest, and he became very popular with a radio show. Every week he had a show, and he would rail against. He didn't like the government getting so involved in the. I shouldn't say that. He wanted the government to take over the banks. He didn't like. He was very critical of bankers and how they were doing, and of course then Jews and communists. They unfortunately people tend to link like Jews with bankers and with people who are not doing a good job. Like for the people, they must be communists, right? Labor unionists are also thrown in there. He was very critical of the New Deal, and basically he had popular support at first, but then he was so out there that he ended up losing support and kind of going away. Francis Townsend was a doctor from California, and he was really wanting to help the older people. He thought that the government should give them a monthly pension. A pension is an amount of money that you're going to give someone, and he thought retired people were really having a hard time. And he did not have much support in Congress, so nothing really happened, but it did kind of bring attention to the problem that people didn't realize that, the elderly were really struggling. Okay. The biggest person who was probably the biggest threat to Roosevelt, though, was Huey Long. Okay. Huey Long was governor of Louisiana, and then after that, a senator. He was a very, very controversial guy. He was like he was a populist, like he was really championing like the poor. But yet he was also really controversial because he would give, jobs to his cronies, and he was like at first a supporter of Roosevelt for his first 100 days, but then he got very critical of him with the second New Deal he did. So he ended up saying he was going to run against Roosevelt in the next election, and he was getting very popular. The people really liked him because he really wanted to tax the wealthy heavily and give every American, make sure they had money. He wanted to give everyone $2,500 a year and a home, which is, more money back then, right? His plan was called the Share Our Wealth Plan, right? Tax the wealthy and give it to the poor, basically. So he was very popular since so many of the poor. And he did a lot of public works in his home state of Louisiana that made him very popular, put people back to work, right? And he was getting very popular, but he got assassinated. And so, of course, then he could not run for office. All right, and then I mentioned the second New Deal. So in 1935, Congress and FDR passed the Revenue Act, raising taxes on the wealthy and the corporations. You hear that people have been calling for that. And it's kind of interesting that maybe that was one of the things that Huey Long wanted. And then, after he dies, Roosevelt does go ahead and do what he wanted. And then the rest of these are called part of the second New Deal, very creatively named, right? Basically, it's a continuation, right, of what he was already doing, trying to keep going with the economy. And it is starting to get better, but still, like 1 out of every 5 people is unemployed. Okay. So the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, is putting people to work with different public building projects and things like that, which we had talked about before. So these second New Deal, 1935 to 41, about 2 million people got back to work through this program. So that was good. And plus, they built a lot of things that we all could benefit from, right? Airports, new bridges and roads, and public buildings. This program was a little more expanded, that it also put a lot of writers, artists, and musicians to work. So they went and beautified, they made murals in public buildings, and they had folk tales and songs recorded, and they wrote down African American stories and Native American traditions written down. So a lot of arts were also included in this second WPA work. So again, it put people back to work, plus it really did kind of help all of us. There's a lot of good history and things written down, cultural things written down during that time. The other major thing that happened during the Second New Deal was the Social Security Act was passed. Now, that is a common thing nowadays you hear, right? You think today probably like Social Security, everyone puts in, required as you work, and then the idea is that the government will help pay you out when you're older, right? Which is one of the concerns that was happening. And so also this point though, they were more worried about unemployment insurance, right? If you lose your job, and that's still true today, you can get some help from the government if you lose your job. But back at this time, they also were trying to expand it to like help other people, the elderly poor, the children of the poor, people with disabilities. So this is really the beginning of like a welfare system, which is something that we have in place today. And it was starting during this depression. Okay, another thing that's happening during the 30s is the labor movement is really growing. Remember, we've talked before about unions and strikes and how there's been, you know, um, not very successful, right, all the time. Okay. Well, there was this time during the 30s, things do get a little bit better for the workers in that sense. Here's an example. This picture is from the General Motors plant when they had a strike in 36 in Flint, Michigan, and it was a sit down strike, meaning that they didn't just strike outside. Remember how we've talked about that before, and then sometimes companies would hire strike breakers, people willing to cross the picket line and go in and work, and then the original strikers would lose their job. Well, they were smart in this one. They went and they stayed in the plant and they sat and they refused to leave. So then workers couldn't come in and take their jobs, right? Because there's already men in there who are in the way. And so after a 44-day standoff, finally the management said, fine, you can, set up your own union. And they chose the United Auto Workers Union to represent their rights. So that was a really big change. And so after that, you start to see some new labor unions forming. The American Federation of Labor had already been created, and it was mostly representing skilled workers by the different crafts that they did. And so now they wanted to try to unite other kinds of workers. So the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was started by John Lewis, who was a mine worker. He was in the United Mine Workers, and they wanted kind of up it a little bit more and have entire industries be organized by their so this became huge. A lot more people joined. About 4 million people joined the CIO, and eventually later in history they're going to join the AFL and the CIO, and they're accepting women and African Americans, which, remember, we've talked about previously, that was not always the case. So a lot more workers are getting protected by having bargaining power together. Okay. Then also Congress is kind of changing its tune, right? The National Labor Relations Act of 1935. It's more popularly known as the Wagner Act. And it guaranteed the workers they do have the right to form unions, so they have more power to collectively bargain with their employees. Remember how in previous times we had talked about how the government was not supportive of that? So now that's changed, and now Congress is saying you do have that right. They also made the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, and Congress said you can't have any more child labor, and we're going to set the minimum wage at 40 cents an hour, which of course sounds really low to us nowadays, but it was a somewhat reasonable minimum at that time. Okay, and then unfortunately for FDR, he's getting challenged by the Supreme Court on some things. In 1935, they struck down parts of the New Deal. I think we mentioned that earlier. And another day that some were struck down as unconstitutional. So he is concerned that all his New Deal programs are going to, get struck down by the Supreme Court. So he gets reelected in 1936, and that election was very clearly like, are the people in favor of the programs I have or not? And since he won with a 61% popular vote, it is clear that he felt like he had the people's approval to do his New Deal, and he was like wanting to make sure that it stayed. And so he actually asked Congress to increase the seats on the Supreme Court, which is a thing that can be done. And you might remember that that's come up in recent years here too, that people are talking about that. So anyway, he wanted them to raise it from 9 to 15, which is higher than they're talking about now. And his plan, of course, was to make sure it got filled with justices who liked his New Deal program, so they would help sway any future votes for the New Deal. Now, a lot of people were critical of this. They felt like he was, they call it court packing, right? Kind of cheating. And even his own supporters were feeling like that wasn't right and kind of subverting the process. When another court case happened for Wagner and the Social Security Acts, and actually the Supreme Court upheld them and did not make them unconstitutional, then he felt like it was less of a threat, the Supreme Court, so he actually dropped, he didn't push his trying to do that plan anymore. And it looked good for a little while. 1937 was a pretty good year. The economy was growing and it looked better. And then, unfortunately, 1938, there was a downturn again in the economy. And so there's a lot going on in Europe and foreign countries, and that starts to be really distracting. And we'll talk about that, but obviously it's going to lead to World War II. And so we will talk about that in the next chapter.